Good evening, everyone. I know I'm an unfamiliar face to a number of you, especially if you're in the first year, you haven't seen me before. I'm one of the campus pastors, like Pastor James, Pastor Josh. I work for the Christian Reformed Church. I'm a minister in that church. And I wear a couple hats on campus. I'm a sessional lecturer. I do quite a bit of work with faculty, Christian faculty. I'm the coordinator of UBC's new multi-faith chaplaincy, which is a considerable job working with the different faith groups. And I don't spend as much time with undergraduates as I'd like. I regret that. But I try once a year to do a small group. You can bring up the next slide for me. I was thinking and praying about what I would do this year, and I decided that in the winter term I would do something on a book called The Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. How many of you have heard of this book or read it? Some of you have heard of it, not many people have read it. That's good, because I want to read it with you. C.S. Lewis, you've probably heard of. He's one of these giants of the Christian faith in the 20th century. Oxford professor, thinker, writer, wrote these beloved children's books, The Chronicles of Narnia. You've probably read some of those or seen the movies, right? They're fantastic books. You read them as kids. Hopefully you read them again as adults because they get even better. But in this book, The Screwtape Letters, it's a work of profound imagination. What Lewis did in the 1940s is he crafted a series of letters between two demons. It's a marvelous work of imagination. And the topic is these two demons are writing letters back and forth on how to tempt a Christian away from faith. And on one side of this diabolical correspondence is this demon named Screwtape. And he's this high-ranking demon in the hierarchy of hell. And he's writing letters, he's offering advice to his nephew, whose name is Wormwood. He's a junior demon who's just been given responsibility for this new Christian, right? A very, very fascinating dynamic. And this book is full of penetrating insights on the spiritual life, all written, as it were, in reverse, like from the perspective of demons thinking about how to tempt us as followers of Jesus away from faith. Just brilliant. I hope you can join me next term for it. I'm telling you all this not as an advertisement, but because I was rereading this book a couple of weekends ago as thinking about what I would do, and I came across this passage that I thought was just perfect for this topic of digital discipleship, which we're looking at this month in UCM. Let me set the scene for you with this particular letter between Screwtape and Wormwood. So Wormwood reports to his uncle that his man, so the human that he's responsible for as a tempter, has entered a season of what we could call spiritual listlessness. His faith isn't running hot, it's lukewarm to cool. He's going to church sometimes. He's reading his Bible, but a little bit. Very relatable, right? Like we've all been there. We could call it, I guess, a kind of spiritual anemia. It's sort of meh. You felt that in your soul, right? So Wormwood gets excited as he's writing to his uncle Screwtape. He thinks because the man is vulnerable, he's ripe for what he calls spectacular wickedness, which is a phrase I like. Spectacular wickedness. You know, like a deceitful business deal or visiting a prostitute or even giving up faith altogether. But Screwtape, the senior demon, the wiser demon, urges him to be cautious. He says, hold on. When a Christian is like this, and Christians often get like this, they are vulnerable, but you don't want to push too hard. All they need is a little bit of distraction. He says this, you can bring up the next slide. You no longer need a good book, which he really likes, to distract him from his prayers or his work or his sleep. Advertisements will do. You can make him waste time, not only in conversation with people he likes, about subjects he enjoys, but conversations with those he cares nothing about, on subjects he's not even interested in. And this is, Screwtape says, because the power of nothing is so very strong. Bring up the next slide. Nothing, Screwtape says, is strong enough to steal away a man's best years, not in sweet sins, but in a dreary flickering of the mind over it knows not what and knows not why. And the gratification of curiosity is so feeble that the man is only half aware of them. And he concludes his letter to Wormwood, reminding him once again that to tempt this man well is not to push him into a spectacular sin. Because the road to hell, he says, is the gradual one, the gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, without signposts. These quotes give you a great sense for what a wonderful writer C.S. Lewis is, right? And his imaginative grasp on the life of the Spirit. But it's also kind of unsettling to read this, I think, if we think a little bit about these quotes in relation to our own connection to God. It's meant to trouble us. It's here on this concept of distraction that Screwtape identifies, being distracted, that I really want to think about what discipleship looks like in a digital age. So think of my talk a little bit like we're running a spiritual diagnostic on us, okay? And I'll be frank up front. Thinking about temptation, whatnot, I want you to forget about your spectacular wickedness, your big sins, okay? Well, don't forget about them. If you're committing them, come and talk to me or Pastor James, or confess them to us. The fact is, though, that distractions work just as well as spectacular sins for leading us away from God. The evil one can use them just as well. And this is the issue for us in the 21st century, because this digital age in which we live is an age of profound distraction, isn't it? It's profoundly distracting. So how do we follow Jesus faithfully, courageously, amidst the glut of distractions we have from our buzzing phones and our blinking screens, from all this information that comes to us through social media, through technology, through the internet? It's a peculiar and significant challenge for being a faithful follower of Jesus Christ in this year, and particularly in your generation. And our speaker last week, Professor Proving, was, I think, absolutely right to locate this concept of discipleship, of digital discipleship, in this big story, the big question of what it means to be human. I know some of you were at that talk, and he emphasized that humankind is created by God for purpose, that we're embodied spirits, and we can't pull those things apart. They belong together. And so we live out our spiritual life in flesh and in blood, both in individuals and communities. This is the first big claim of the Christian story, of the biblical story. And the second big claim of the Christian story, of the biblical narrative, is that embodied humankind, us, has fallen. We've fallen away from God through sin. We've rebelled from him, and we need to be redeemed. Right? And as Screwtape so brilliantly argues, even among the redeemed, there's this kind of rebellious streak. We fall into listlessness, or we fall away from God. None of this is new to you if you've grown up in the church, or if you're a Christian. You know this. We get pulled between the old life and the new, between God and the devil. Our hearts are divided. We're divided. That's our predicament and our plight as sinners. You bring up the next slide. Psalm 86 says, "Teach me your ways, O Lord. Give me an undivided heart that I may fear your name." Important imperatives here. Teach me, give me. These are the requests of a woman or a man who knows that it's really hard to focus on what really matters, which is God. Our hearts are divided. And it's only by the grace of God and through great effort that we can give our undivided heart to anything or to anyone. We're prone to distraction. Why are we prone to distraction? What's wrong with us? This is this great existential question. Why do we get so easily distracted? You could probably answer it a few ways. Here's one way I like to think of it. This is from one of my favorite philosophers, Blaise Pascal. You might have come across Pascal in mathematics class. You might have come across him in philosophy. He says this: "I have often said that the sole cause of our unhappiness is that we don't know how to stay quietly in our room. When I said philosopher, you weren't expecting this kind of quote, were you? Fascinating thought, isn't it? The sole cause of our unhappiness is that we don't know how to stay quietly in our room. What does he mean? I think of it like this. Think back to when you were a small kid and you got in trouble with your parents. How many of you would get sent to your room? Yeah, a lot of us, right? I do the same to my kids when they were small. The idea when you get sent to your room is that you're kind of alone, right? Without distractions, ideally. I got sent in the corner. So I was alone there without my toys, without my books, whatnot. Maybe this happened to you. It happened to your siblings, I'm sure. Maybe not to you. What happens when we're alone? What are we alone with when we're just sitting there with nothing to distract us? Our thoughts. Or maybe we could say our conscience. We're alone with our conscience. This is what Pascal's getting at. We don't want ever to be alone with our conscience. Deep down, we want to be distracted. We want to be distracted and diverted. This is what Screwtape is getting after as well. This is the power of nothing. We want to be diverted. We want to be distracted. So if we're sitting quietly in a room by ourselves, how long do you last before you reach for your phone? 30 seconds, a minute, a couple minutes. Most of the time, we're itching for it, right? We want to be distracted because if we were to stop and sit quietly in our rooms, who's there? We might begin to hear our conscience. We might begin to feel this great gaping hole at the center of our existence, a hole so big that nothing but God can fill it. But this is our dilemma as fallen humans, as fallen women and men. We want to be happy, but the only thing that will make us happy is God. And from him, we will run into a million distractions. From him, we will flee into diversions. We will distract ourselves to death. I think Pascal has a deep, deep insight into the human condition. I think if we're honest with ourselves, we kind of know he's right, even if it makes us uncomfortable thinking of it. Pascal admits that he took this insight just from the Bible, actually, particularly the book of Ecclesiastes and 1 Corinthians and other books. As the Bible describes the human condition, it's like we have a spiritual ADHD. This isn't a problem neurologically or cognitively. It's a problem with our hearts. We suffer from a kind of spiritual ADHD. We distract ourselves from what's truly important, what truly matters, because we're hiding from God, a God who's relentlessly searching for us. If we'd only stop running, we distract ourselves from the darkness that's within and the darkness that's without. The very beginning of the Bible, you can bring up the next slide, God calls out to Adam and Eve, the first man and woman in the garden, this great symbolic story, and he says, "Where are you?" And they're hiding because they've sinned. And that question follows every single one of us, every woman and man, ever since then. Where are you? God says to us. Give me your undivided attention. Give me your heart, because I'm what's good for you. But from this God, we hide. We let ourselves be distracted and diverted. So here's the challenge of discipleship. Given this human condition, given this plight we're in as sinners, the challenge of discipleship, it's very, very easy to be distracted from God. It's very easy to distract ourselves to death here in the digital age. And you know this. I don't need to go over with you all the studies, because you know them as well, how internet algorithms function on our minds or the effects that screen pixels have on our attention. Right? Recall what Screwtape says. We don't need a good book to distract us from our prayers or our work or church or sleep. He says ads will do. I mean, nowadays it's not ads, but TikTok or memes or YouTube videos or the whereabouts of Taylor Swift right now. I have 2 teenage daughters, so it's an important question in my house sometimes. And we were going to visit my wife's family in Germany in the summer, and my daughters are like, Dad, we've got to go see Taylor Swift in Berlin. No, we don't. Anyway, I'm getting distracted. But this is nothing. Like where Taylor Swift is, I'm sorry if you're a Swiftie, but where she is not important. It's nothing. But people will spend a lot of time on trivial things like that, on nothing. Nothing, says Screwtape, is very, very powerful. And you know how social media distracts us from seriously engaging with real issues through reasonable reflection. Instead, it stokes our emotions and it ferments outrage. And you know how your social media habits distract you, divert you from spending real time with your friends, right? From loved ones. This is this embodied community that Professor Proving was talking about. We know all this. These pathetic amusements, these small distractions, they work just as well as spectacular sins to lead us away from God, to keep us in the shadows. Think about that. Can you sit quietly in your room? Now, God has not abandoned the work of his hands. He searches out the shadows to which we flee. In fact, Christians confess that in Jesus Christ, God has come into the world as the light of the world. He's searching for his lost ones. He's searching for us, and he calls out to us. And his voice can be heard amidst this din of distractions. Where are you? Come and follow me. Be my disciple. To be a disciple, as Jesus himself says, you can bring up the next slide. Jesus himself says, and I think this is one of the most beautiful descriptions of an undivided heart in the whole Bible. To be a disciple, as Jesus says, is to love God and to love your neighbor. And he quotes the Old Testament, the Jewish law. Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And you shall love this God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. And the second is this, you should love your neighbor as yourself. This is discipleship in sum. And one great theologian who's someone I go back to repeatedly, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German theologian, observes that we love God, we show our love for God, first of all, by listening to him, by listening to his word. And we show our love for our neighbor, first and foremost, by listening to them, by listening to their words. What do they have to say? So there's this close connection between loving as disciples and listening to God and to neighbor. But this carries the challenge for us as disciples in this digital age, in the 21st century. Amidst all these distractions that pour in among us, around us, all the time, how do we keep listening for the voice of the one who's calling out to us? Where are you? Come and follow me. And if our divided heart is keen to be distracted from God, how do we cultivate the habits and form the character necessary to abide with God and hear his voice, and to hear the voice of our neighbor who's crying out in need for someone to love them? This is the challenge of discipleship, and it's a real challenge. And in the last 10 minutes of my talk, I want to throw out a couple suggestions, 3 really, for how we can maybe begin to do this. This is just things I've found helpful and important. Maybe this works for you, maybe not. That's fine. But it's a start. It's a kind of small template. And I'm playing around with this idea of discipleship as showing love for God and neighbor by listening to them. The challenge again being, how do we listen in an age, in a time that is full of distraction and with hearts that are prone to being distracted? 3 points. You can bring up the next slide. God calls out to us in creation. But do we hear him? Do we hear him? This is before your time, this picture. It's probably 10 years old by now, but it made a big splash of a guy on his phone while a humpback whale, breaches beside his boat. But we've all been there though, right? Like we've missed incredible things around us. So as I was preparing this talk, I started last Friday thinking about it, and I was sitting on the second floor of Commons, on the second floor with this bank of windows that you look out over the UNC and all these buildings. It was a gorgeous fall day. The sky was blue, and the leaves on campus are gold, and there was a V of Canada geese flying through campus on their way south. And I watched, and every third or fourth student was walking like this, right, with their phone in front of them. We've all done it, right? But it's every third or fourth student and faculty. Like, it wasn't just your age, it was my age too. We're walking around with our eyes at our phones. God speaks to us in creation. Where are you? He says, I'm revealed here in my glory and in my majesty, in things great and small, things beautiful and basic. We need to look and listen. God speaks. Last week at UCM, we sang a song called Christ Be Magnified. You know the song, right? You guys were into it. You were singing it. Don't hate me because I'm going to criticize it, okay? It begins like this. Were creation suddenly articulate, then we'd hear Christ be magnified. This is the subjunctive mood of a verb. Were creation suddenly articulate? Creation is articulate. Scripture is very, very clear about that. And we heard that in the song we sang earlier, right? It said God breathes out and 100 million creatures catch his breath, something like that. That's more aligned with the Bible. If you bring up the next slide. Psalm 19, of one of many psalms I could choose, the heavens are telling the glory of God, and the skies proclaim his handiwork. Day after day, they pour forth speech. And it says they have no words, they have no voice, and yet they have voice, and they use words. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. It's a beautiful thought. God is speaking to you in creation. Are we listening, though? Creation helps us hear the Creator. The grain of wood, the smell of roasting coffee beans, the cell under your microscope, the sound of a bird. Go for a walk. Go jogging in the rain. Feel the warm sun on your face and the wind in your hair. Walk across campus with our eyes open and our ears open, with our phone in our pocket, right? God is calling out to us. Practically, one thing I do, you might find this helpful, but maybe not. When I wake up in the morning, I have my alarm on my phone and I turn it off, but I don't touch my phone. I get out of bed and I open the curtains and I discipline myself to spending at least 30 seconds looking at the sky. And in warm weather, I will open the window or I will go outside. I listen to the sky and I listen for a bird. I look at the sky, I listen for a bird, and I smell the air. Have you ever smelled the air early in the morning? It's beautiful. You were saying at 5:30 in the morning, God's painting a canvas, an amazing canvas before your eyes, isn't he? Do that every morning. Maybe not get up at 5:30, but do that every morning. Before you look at your phone, look at what God has made. It's a discipline for me. This is what I think it means to be embodied, to be part of this world, to be flesh and blood. This is what it means to be a disciple in our digital age. It's my second point. God calls out to us in Scripture. Again, are we too distracted to hear him? Now, this is a big topic, and it's one that we probably all agree. God speaks through his word, through the Bible. And I want to just raise one point. We love God by listening to his voice, which is revealed first and foremost in Scripture. Not in creation, but first and foremost in Scripture. And I know that a lot of you read the Bible regularly, which is wonderful. You're listening to God's voice. But I'm going to push it even further. It's not just that we hear God's voice in Scripture. It's how we do it. Here's what I mean. Again, I'm going to draw on a German philosopher, Georg Hegel. I like German philosophers, by the way, but I'm not going to beat you over the head with them. This is one of Hegel's few intelligible statements. Reading the morning newspaper is the realist's morning prayer. So he lived in the early 19th century. So if we were to translate or update his phrase for today, we would say Scrolling through my social media feed or the news first thing in the morning is the realist's morning prayer, right? We all reach for our phone first thing in the morning, don't we? Don't we? And we lie in bed and we scroll through our feeds and we scroll through the news. And we all know, and we do this in the evening as well, right? Before we go to bed, even though we know we're not supposed to. We all know this isn't really a good habit. Yeah? I'm not going to get into that. I want you to consider whether it's not just a bad habit, but whether what you're doing is a religious act. Because Hegel says it is. This is the realist's morning prayer or evening prayer. This is what really challenged me about this thought. What we do when we reach for our phone first thing in the morning or last thing at night is an act of devotion. We let the first word of the day come to us, not from God and his story, but from the story told by the world, a story that screams for our attention. This is what's important. This is what matters, and this is what's real. This is what philosophers call our horizon of meaning. When we reach for our phones first thing or last thing, our horizon of meaning is being shaped by a story that is not the story told by God. We have another God. But Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu. God is one. We don't have another God. There is just one. We want his story to determine our reality. We then fit the world's events into that story. What we're doing when we're doing our morning prayers this way is we're letting the story of the world shape our horizon of meaning, and then God's words get fitted into it. We've got it all backwards. So our way of understanding the world is actually skewered. Let's not get distracted, diverted by God and his word, by these million small details that scream for our attention, from influencers, from news feeds, from peers on social media. God is calling out to us in his word. Where are you? Again, a practical tip for me, this might be helpful, might not. I've disciplined myself to not open my laptop or look at my phone until God has spoken to me in his word. Just a verse. And I do the same thing in the evening. I want God to have the first word of the day and the last word. I want this horizon to be between his extremities, these two poles. This is a kind of daily liturgy for me, a way of shaping, so that I can try to evaluate and understand everything else I hear this day through his word. I found this helpful. This is what I find helpful being a disciple in this distracting digital age. Here's my last point. God calls out to us in our neighbor's need. Again, are we too distracted to hear? Can we love our neighbor as we're called to as disciples if we can't hear them? One of the most difficult passages in the whole Bible, and I'll show it to you on the screen, Jesus says this to his followers. I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me something to eat. I was alone and away from home, and you invited me into your house. I was without clothes. You gave me something to wear. I was sick, and you cared for me. I was in prison, and you visited me. And then the good people will answer, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or alone or sick or in prison? I tell you the truth, Jesus says, anything you refuse to do for even the least of my people, you refuse to do for me. Really, really challenging. I had to preach on this once, and I did not like having to do it. It's really hard to preach on this sermon. It's hard to talk on this sermon. It's very challenging. One of the hardest things Jesus said. Jesus is saying he speaks out to us in the least of these. He encounters us. He's calling out to us in the least of these, the people we meet who are broken and busted and battered. These are the people in which Christ is revealed. And we are surrounded by people who are broken and hurting. They're in your classrooms. They're in your labs. They're in your dorms. You encounter them on campus. We encounter them everywhere we go. People like us who are maybe hiding from God. Do we see them? Can we hear them? The challenge, I think, in the digital age, the age in which we're in, is that it's become very, very hard to see and hear others who are not exactly like us. You know how social media platforms tend to create these identity groups based on common interest or perspective. So we end up in these so-called virtual communities that often look like us. We're tribalized. We have these small identity groups. It's very, very hard for us to see people beyond these groups sometimes, especially those who aren't affluent, who are broken. And if you're at university, like it or not, even though you're a poor student, we're affluent, right? We're elite. Can we see other people? And then on the other hand, social media, as you know, it grooms us to parade our best self, right? Snapchat, Instagram, all the filters we use. We're always parading our best self, our best story, our best experience. What we're doing, though, is shaping our minds to only see people a particular way. People who've been filtered, who are presenting their best self. This isn't most people, and it's not even us. How can we see those people who don't look like this, who aren't presenting their best self? How can we see them? How can we hear their cries, the cries of what Jesus calls the least of these? I think this is a huge challenge of discipleship in the 21st century, a challenge of discipleship in the digital age. But a people who are shaped by the crucified one, Jesus Christ, and his story, we're going to be the kind of people who should be able to see the scars and the hurts of those people in our neighborhood and our communities, to hear the call, the cries of the least of these, even if most people around us can't see them, even if our social media is working against us. Our faith in Jesus, the rejected one, should help us be able to see the one who is rejected and hear their cries so that we can truly love them. So God calls out to us all around us in creation, in his word of life. And he calls out to us through his neighbor in need. Discipleship means to love God and our neighbor, and therefore to listen to him. When our digital spaces and practices distract us from hearing God and our neighbor, and they do, like we all know they do, well, then 2 weeks ago, Andy Garbrook was here and he was talking about redeeming digital spaces. Yeah, maybe. I think sometimes we need to go further than that, though. I think some digital spaces and practices need to be crucified. Really. I know some of you are thinking, wow, this guy's a pessimist. I am. Some of you are thinking, oh, he's exaggerating. I might be. Come on, Dr. Statham, it's not that big a deal that I grab my phone first thing in the morning or I spend 3 hours a day scrolling. Perhaps you're right. Perhaps it's nothing. Nothing, as Screwtape says, is strong enough to steal away the best years of our life in a dreary flickering of the mind over it knows not what and it knows not why. When our hearts are divided, the evil one can use distractions just as well as those spectacular sins you fear to take us from the light or to keep us in the shadows. That's what I think, but you can disagree with me. I've got 2 questions for you to look through. Take 10 minutes, break into groups of, 5, 6, whatever's natural around you, and talk about these questions. Disagree with me, agree with me, talk to each other.